Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. Namaskaram. Today I want to talk about how are we to know what actually exists and what are the obstacles which are preventing us from knowing that as it is now. In what is it that actually exists? As Bhagavan says, for example, in the verse 13 of Uludunapadu, he begins by saying, Jnanamam Tane Me. That means oneself who is jnana alone is real. Jnana here means pure awareness. So what is it that prevents us knowing ourselves as we actually are? As he indicates in the next sentence of that verse, he says, Nanabam jnanam ajnanamam. Knowledge or awareness of multiplicity is ignorance. So this is what is it's our knowledge of multiplicity that prevents us from knowing ourselves as we actually are. Bhagavan says this in another way in the 7th paragraph of Nana. What he says in this paragraph is, he begins by saying, Yatatamai Ulludu Atma Swarupa Mondre. What actually exists is only Atma Swarupa. Atma Swarupa, Swarupa literally means own form, but it's a word that is used in the sense of the real nature, or the very nature. And Atma means oneself. So Atma Swarupa is the real nature of ourself, or the very nature of ourself. So what actually exists is our own real nature, Bhagavan says. So since we alone are what is real, we alone are what actually exists, why do we not know ourselves as we actually are? He gives a clue in the rest of this paragraph. In the next sentence, he says, Sipil Velipol Adil, Jagajiva Shwaragal, Sipi Velipol Adil Karpanegal. That means the world, soul, and God are karpane. Karpane means fabrications, or imaginations, or mental creations, illusory superimpositions. Adil, in it. In it means in Atma Swarupa, sipil velipol, like silver in a shell. In other words, like the illusory silver we see in a shell, the world, soul, and God are just appearances. Ive mundrum ekakalatil tondri, ekakalatil marekindrana. These three appear simultaneously and disappear simultaneously. Swarupa, Swarupa me jagam. Swarupa alone is the world. That is our real nature, alone is the world. Swarupa me nan. Swarupa alone is I. That implies ego, or the jiva, the soul. Swarupa me ishwaram. Swarupa alone is God. Ellam Shiva Swarupa me. All is Shiva Swarupa. So everything is only our real nature. But so long as we know everything, because all the many things that we know, the world, soul, and God, are just fabrications. They're not what is real. They're just an illusory appearance, like the silver in the shell. So in order to know, how can we know ourselves as we actually are? This is what Bhagavan's teachings are all about. He also says the same thing in another way in the first verse of Atma-vichara. That is in the, as Murugan pointed out in the Anupallavi of Atma-vichara. Noya tamakum ulankai amala kani poi poiai and oria mikumei uludu atma. That is, oneself exists as so very real, even for those who are simple-minded, but an amalaka fruit on the palm ends as unreal. That is usually, to illustrate that something is very real and very obvious, that is patently obvious, extremely clear. The analogy that is often given in Tamil, it's often said, "Ulunkai nelikani." That means nelikani means the amalaka fruit. So that means like the amalaka fruit in the palm. That means something is very, very clear. But as Murugan points out here, ourself, our own existence is so very clear, even that amalaka becomes something unreal in comparison. So the one thing we all know very, very clearly is ourself. That is, we all know I am. We know I am more clearly than we know any other thing. But though, as Bhagavan says in this first verse, Mayai nirantaram tan ayadu or nayadu irendadabum. Though oneself exists incessantly or and indubitably, or imperishably, that ayadu or nayadu, we can split it in two ways. It can either mean indubitably or imperishably. In other words, we constantly exist without any doubt as real. But one thing the one thing we cannot reasonably doubt is our own existence. So though we exist as indubitably, incessantly and indubitably as real, Hoyam udumbu ulahum mayai mulaitu erum. The unreal body and world rise, sprouting as if real. That is, what actually exists is only ourselves. Yet this body and world appear as if real. What is the cause for the appearance of this body and world? As he doesn't say explicitly here, but he implies in the next sentence that it is thought, because he then goes on in the next sentence to say, when unreal darkness pervaded thought is dissolved without reviving even an iota, in the reality pervaded heart space, oneself, the sun, implying the sun of pure awareness, certainly will shine by oneself. Darkness will cease, suffering will end, happiness will surge forth. So the implication here is that thought is the obstacle. It's thought that causes the appearance of the body and world. So if thought ceases, the reality will then shine forth as it is. That is the implication. And he further emphasizes this in the next verse, but I will not deal with the next verse immediately. So to understand how we can know what is real, what actually exists, the term in Tamil for what exists is ulladu. Ulladu literally means what exists or what is. This is the subject of the first Mangalam verse of Ulladu Napadu. What Bhagavan says in this first Mangalam verse is, Ulladu alladu, ulla unuvu ullado. This sentence can be interpreted in several ways. The basic meaning is, if what exists were not, would existing awareness exist? That is, if there wasn't something that actually exists, could there be any awareness of something existing, or could any awareness exist? The fact that we are aware means that we actually exist, is the implication. That sentence can also be interpreted to mean, except as ulladu, what actually exists, does ulla unavu exist? Does the existing awareness exist? In other words, what actually exists is only the existing awareness. And that ulla unavu can also be taken as an awareness to think. So that sentence can also be taken to mean, other than ulladu, is there an awareness to think of it? But the basic meaning is, if ulladu did not exist, would there be an existing awareness? And then he goes on to say, ulla porul, ulla lara, ulla te, ulla dal. Since the existing substance what he refers to here as ullaporul is what he referred to in the first sentence as ulladu. But that ulladu means what exists. Ullaporul means the substance that exists, the reality that exists. So ullaporul, ullalara, ullate, ulladal. Since the existing substance exists in the heart without thought or without thinking, in other words, devoid of thought, ullamenum, ullaporul, ullalevan, how to think of the existing substance. How to, even can mean how to or who can think of the existing substance. So since the reality exists in the heart, that means deep within ourselves, in the very core of ourselves, in the very center of ourselves, since it exists there without thought, that is beyond the range of thought, how can we think of it? How can we as the mind know that reality that exists beyond thought? And that's the question he asked. Oh, and that reality, not only does it exist in the heart, it is itself the heart. In other words, when Bhagavan talks about heart, heart is another name for our real nature, for what we actually are. That is, the center of ourself is what we actually are. So, ullamenam, ullaporul, ullalevan. Who can or how to think of that existing reality? That is, how to meditate upon what actually exists. The answer he gives is ullate, ullapadi, ullade, ullal. That means being in the heart as it is, alone is thinking of it. So the heart is that which the heart is. Being in the heart as it is. That means as it is means as that ullaporul, which is called the heart, as it is. So how is it? Firstly, it exists as awareness, the existing awareness, as he indicates in the first sentence, and it is beyond thought. So we have to remain just as pure being, as pure awareness, without thought. That is meditating on it. Know this. So to understand this more clearly, it's useful to come to Upadesha Undya. In Upadesha Undya, verse 23, Bhagavan says much the same thing, but in a more compact way. What he says in verse 23 is, Ulladu unara unavu verin mayin, ulladu unavahum. That means because of the non-existence of any awareness other than what exists, to be aware of what exists is awareness. That is, if to know what exists, there cannot be any awareness other than it. Because if there was an awareness other than what exists, it would be a non-existent awareness, because whatever is other than what exists is non-existent. So there cannot be any awareness other than what exists to know what exists. So what exists itself is awareness. And then he concludes that verse by saying, Unave namai ulam, that awareness, that is what exists, is the implication. Unave, awareness alone exists as we. That is, we ourselves are that awareness, which is what exists. So what exists is only ourself. What actually, as he said in the 7th paragraph of Nana, Yatatamai ulladu Atma-vichara. What actually exists is only the real nature of ourself. So that what actually exists is only awareness, and that awareness is ourself. As he says in verse 13 of Uladu Napadu, Jnanamam tane me, oneself who is awareness alone is real. So that what actually exists is, that is, awareness is nothing other than what actually exists. And what actually exists is nothing other than awareness. What actually exists is awareness, and that awareness, which is what actually exists, alone is what exists as we. That is, what we essentially are is nothing but that existing awareness. So since we are that awareness, that existing awareness, Ulu, as Bhagavan referred to it as in the first Mangalam verse of Uludunapadu, why is it we don't know ourselves as such? Bhagavan indicates the answer to that in the next verse, in verse 24. In verse 24, instead of referring to Uladu, he refers to Isa. Isa means God. In this context, Isa, because as Bhagavan said in that seventh paragraph of Nana, it is Swarupa alone but appears as the world. It is Swarupa alone but appears as ego. It is Swarupa alone but appears as God. So what God actually is only Swarupa, only our own real nature. So God, what he referred to in verse 24 as Uladu, what exists, is what he refers to in this verse 25 as Isa. And what he says in verse 25 is, Irakum ekayal Isa jivagal oruporle arba. That means by existing nature, God and soul are just one substance. What he means by existing nature, irakum eke, is our existence as mere being, as pure being, as what actually exists. So in our essential being, we and God are just one substance. That one substance, or oruporol, is itself our existing nature. That is, that one substance, but is the reality of both God and ourself, is what he refers to as Uladu, what actually exists, and that is awareness. So since we and God are just one substance, why does it seem to us that we are something separate from God? That is, we consider God to be something very, in every way superior to ourselves. We seem to be a limited, finite jiva, limited in time, limited in space, limited in knowledge, limited in power, limited in every respect. And God we consider to be unlimited in every respect. So what is it that makes us seem to be different from God? Bhagavan answered that in the last line of this verse. He says, Upadi unave veru. That means, Upadi unavu means, Upadi means adjuncts. Unavu means awareness. So awareness of adjuncts alone is different. That is, though what we actually are is nothing other than God, because we are now aware of ourselves as a set of adjuncts, we are now aware of ourselves as I am this body. So long as we identify ourselves with this awareness of adjuncts, we seem to be separate from God. So this alone is what makes us seem to be different from God. So the logical implication he points out in the next verse, verse 25. What he says in verse 25 is, Tane upadi vittu ovadu, tan isan tane unavadam. That means knowing oneself, leaving aside or without adjuncts, is itself knowing God. Tanai olivadam dal. Because of shining as oneself. That is, because God shines as the reality of ourself, if we know ourself without adjuncts, that itself is knowing God. Because our self minus adjuncts is God. That is what our self plus adjuncts is ego. Our self minus adjuncts is God, is the reality, is Uladu. So this is how we are to know God. Bhagavan approaches this from a slightly different way in Uladu Napadu. In Uladu Napadu, in verse 7, he points out what he says in verse 7. He talks about two things, Ulahu, which means world, and Arivu, which means awareness. But what he says about awareness here he's not talking about the real awareness here. He's talking about the awareness but knows the world. In other words, the mind. So in this context, Arivu means mind or ego, that the awareness but knows the world, because he says, Ulhu aribu ondrai uditu odungum enum. Though the world and awareness arise and subside simultaneously. So here the awareness he's talking about is not the real awareness, because the real awareness, as he says in verse 24 of Uludnaptu, Satchit Udiyadu. So Satchit does, the real awareness that never rises, but the awareness that rises and subsides simultaneously with the world is only ego or mind. So here he's using arivu, awareness, in the sense of ego. So I'll just paraphrase it slightly. Though the world and ego rise and subside simultaneously, ulhu arivu tannal olirum. The world shines only by awareness. The world shines only by ego. That is, it is only in the view of ego that the world seems to exist. So ego is the light, but by which the world shines. Without ego, without the mind, there's no such thing as world. In the previous verse he had pointed out, in verse 6 he pointed out, he said, Uluhu aim pulangal uru. The world is a form of 5 sense impressions, there Andrew, not anything else. So the world is nothing but these 5 kinds of sense impressions. In other words, sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and tactile sensations. If you take away these 5, there's no such thing as world. All that we know as world is only these 5 kinds of sense impressions. And then he goes on to say, I'm poriku pulanam. Those 5 sense impressions are impressions known to the 5 sense organs. Ulahei manam ondru I'm porivayal onindidu talal. Since the mind alone knows since one mind, or the mind alone knows the world by way of the 5 sense organs, manate andri ulahu undo. Is there a world other than the mind? So the world has no existence other than the mind, is what Bhagavan implies here. So, and not only does the world not have an existence independent of the mind, it doesn't shine independent of the mind, is what he implies in this 7th verse. Though the world and the mind rise and subside simultaneously, it is by the mind alone that the world shines. And then he goes on to say, Uluhu aribu tondri marivadaku idanai tondri mariadu olirum pundramam akde porul. That is, the substance, that is, porul means substance. Porul is a Tamil word, but is more or less equivalent to the Sanskrit word vastu. So the reality or substance, but the real substance that shines without appearing and disappearing. Tondri mariadu, uluhu aribu tondri marivadaku idanai, as the base or the ground for the foundation for the appearance and disappearance of the world. That is, Bhagavan often used to compare our real nature to the screen. The screen in a cinema. The screen is always present. Whether the pictures appear on it or not, the screen is ever shining. So like that, the real substance exists without appearing and disappearing as the screen on which the world and the mind, which and the awareness that knows it, appear and disappear. So that which shines without appearing and disappearing as the ground for the appearing and disappearing of ego and the world, akde poro, that alone is the Oh, sorry. That which shines without appearing and disappearing as the ground for the appearing and disappearing of the world, that alone is the substance, which is the whole. So here he's talking, but what he referred to in the first Mangalam verse as Ulla Porul is the same Porul he's referring to here, the one underlying reality. And there he said it exists in the heart without thought. Here he says it exists without appearing and disappearing. It shines without appearing and disappearing. It exists without appearing and disappearing. And he also says it is Pundram. Pundram is a Tamil word, but it's a Tamil adaptation of the Sanskrit word Purna. So it means the whole, the totality of all that is. So that is the Porul. That is what actually exists. And so the world is not real. The mind that knows the world is not real. What is real is because the world and the mind appear and disappear. But what is real is the underlying reality. So how are we to know that underlying reality? How can we see that underlying reality? He talks about that in the next verse, verse 8. What he says in verse 8 is, Eperitu evuruvul etinum a per uruvil apporule kanvari adu. What that means is, whoever worships in whatever form, giving whatever name, that is the way to see that substance in name and form. That is generally that underlying reality is what we take to be God, and we attribute to God as so many different names and forms according to which name and form appeals to us, and we worship that God in name and form. So what Bhagavan is saying here is, whoever worships that reality in whatever form and giving whatever name, that is the way to see that substance in name and form. Per uruvil here means in name and form. Some people have taken this to mean, but they take per uruvil. Il is the locative case ending. So per uruvil means in name and form. Il can also be taken to mean illada, which is without name and form. So some people take it to mean that is the way to see that nameless and formless reality. Per uruvil can be taken as nameless and formless. But even if we take it in that way, even if we take it to mean, but it's true, but that reality is nameless and formless. But what type of seeing is Bhagavan talking about here? He's talking about seeing it in name and form. That is, if we worship in name and form, that is the way to see it in name and form. He doesn't mean that we can, but that is the way to see it without name and form, as he makes clear in the next sentence. That is, in the first sentence, the type of seeing he's talking about is per uruvil, in name and form. In the next sentence, he tells us how to see it unmayil, in reality. So he begins the second sentence with the word ayinum. Ayinum means however. So he said one thing in the first sentence, and he's saying a contrasting thing in the second sentence. So this word ayinum is very important. Ayinum, however, anmei porulin unmeil, tan unmeyine ondu, odungi ondrutale, unmeil kanal una. Sometimes in Tamil verses, in order to interpret a Tamil verse, the first thing we need to do is padachetam. That is, we need to split the word up into words, because in Tamil, the words are joined together by sandhi, and the verses are split, not according to the words, but according to the metrical feet. So in order to understand the meaning of a verse, the first thing we need to do is to split it up into individual words as padachetam. But even that is sometimes not sufficient, because sometimes in poetry, the natural prose order of words is not followed in poetry. So sometimes it's also necessary to do what is called anvayam. Anvayam is rearranging the words in prose order. So here Bhagavan says, Amme porolin unmayal tan unmaye ondu. Some people have translated this as knowing one's own reality in the reality of that real substance. But what does it mean, knowing one's own reality in the reality of that real substance? That is not what is meant. If we do the anvayam, then it becomes clear what is mean. If we rearrange this sentence in the natural prose order, the meaning becomes clearer. Ayinum tan unmayine ondu. However, knowing one's own reality, amme porolin unmayil odungi. Delay, subsiding and merging in the reality of that real substance. So when he says in the reality of that real substance, it's not knowing our own reality in that, it is subsiding and being one with that. Odungi means subsiding. Ondru means merging or becoming one with that. That alone is unmayil carnal. That alone is seeing in truth. So the whole of this verse, the meaning of the whole verse is, whoever worships in whatever form, giving whatever name, that is the way to see that substance in name and form. However, investigating the reality of oneself, dissolving in the reality of that true substance, becoming one alone is seeing in reality. In other words, we can worship God in name and form, and if we worship God in name and form, we will see him in name and form. But that is not the real seeing. The real seeing is to invest, because God is the reality of ourself. So investigating the reality of ourself, and thereby subsiding and dissolving in the reality of that real substance and becoming one with it, that alone is seeing in reality. That alone is the real seeing. As Bhagavan said in verse 25 of Upadeshundya, but I read earlier, seeing oneself without adjuncts knowing oneself without adjuncts is knowing God, because God shines as oneself. So how to know that God, the underlying reality, the porol, that shines as the base for the appearing and disappearing of everything else? It is by investigating the reality of ourself. By investigating the reality of ourself, ego will thereby subside and dissolve back into its own reality, in other words, that true substance, the reality of that true substance, and thereby become one with it, and that alone is seeing in reality. But this is the correct meaning, is also made very clear by Bhagavan in some of the later verses of Ulunaptu. In verse 20, he again takes up the subject of knowing or seeing God. What he says in verse 20 is, in the first sentence, he says, Karnam tane vittu, leaving oneself who sees, tan kaduvale karnal, karnam manomayamam kakshi. That means leaving oneself who sees, oneself seeing God is seeing a mental vision. That what he means by that is, if we instead of investigating the reality of ourselves, as he said in verse 8, if we ignore ourselves and we see God as something other than ourselves, we are seeing only a mental vision. And then he goes on to say, the next sentence is a very, very it's very beautifully worded, but we need to pay very close attention to it to understand what Bhagavan is talking about, because in this sentence, he uses the word tan. Tan means oneself. He uses it he uses it several times. He says tanne, that's the accusative case form of it. He says tan. He says tan mudale, tan mudalpoi, tan kadbul. So he's using this word oneself. So if we take the literal meaning of this sentence is, only one who sees oneself, the origin of oneself, is one who has seen God, because the origin oneself going, oneself is not other than God. What he means by that is only one who sees oneself, that means only one who sees one's own real nature, the origin, base or foundation of oneself. That is when he says, tan mudale means the origin or base or foundation of oneself. So one who sees oneself, the base of oneself, means one who sees one's real nature, the base of oneself. Here, the base of oneself means the base of ego, is one who has seen God, because oneself, meaning one's real nature, which alone is what remains when oneself, the origin or root of all other things, goes, is not other than God. It's very, very, that Bhagavan has packed a lot into this sentence. So the basic meaning is, only one who sees one's real nature, which is the origin of oneself as ego, is one who has seen God, because the origin, oneself, meaning ego, which is the origin of all other things, when that goes, oneself, in the absence of ego, oneself is not other than God, is the implication. So this makes it very clear that what he meant in verse 8, when he talked about worshipping in name and form, that is the way to see God in name and form. But to see God in reality, we need to investigate the reality of ourselves, and thereby we need to merge in the reality of God. That is seeing him in truth. And he continues the same idea in verse 21. What he says in verse 21 is, tanne tan kanal, oneself seeing oneself. Talevan tanne kanal, seeing God. Ennum pal nul unme enne enin. That means, if one asks, what is the truth of many texts that say oneself seeing oneself and seeing God? So what is meant when it is talked about in the sacred texts in the scriptures about oneself seeing oneself or oneself seeing God? What is meant? Bhagavan answers, tanne tan kanal eban, tan ondral. That means, since oneself is one, tan ondral, how is oneself to see oneself? That is, how can we see ourselves? When we are one, we cannot see ourselves as an object, obviously. So how are we to see ourselves? And then he goes on to say, kana onadel, if it's not possible to see, implying if it's not possible for oneself to see oneself, Talevan Karnal Eban, how is it possible to see God? If we cannot see ourselves, how can we see God? Then he gives the answer, very, very beautiful answer. 3 very simple but extremely profound words. Un Adal Khan. Un means food. Adal means becoming. Khan means seeing. Becoming food is seeing. So what does he mean by this? In order to see ourselves, or in order to see God, we need to become food. That is, as ego, we cannot know ourselves as we actually are. As ego, we cannot know God as he actually is. In order to know him as he actually is, we need to be swallowed by him. In other words, as Bhagavan said in verse 8, in verse 8 he said, Tan unmeyine ondu. Knowing, ondu means investigating or knowing. Investigating or knowing the reality of oneself. Am meiporalin unmeyil ondru odungi ondru delay. Subsiding, merging, and becoming one with that, dissolving in that. That is true seeing. That's what he means here by saying becoming food is seeing. That is, we need to lose ourselves completely in God. So long as we remain separate from God, we cannot know God as he is. We need to lose ourselves in God. In other words, as Bhagavan said in verse 25 of Upadesha Undiyar, we need to see ourselves without we need to see ourselves without adjuncts. So long as we see ourselves with adjuncts, we are not seeing God as he actually is. So we can see him as he actually is only by seeing ourselves without adjuncts. Seeing ourselves without adjuncts means losing ourselves in him, becoming food to him. As soon as we see ourselves without adjuncts, we cease to exist as anything separate. We are swallowed by him entirely. We become food to him. And then he continued the same theme in verse 22, again talking about seeing God. But here he takes it from a different angle. This verse 22 is an extreme, each one of these verses is extremely important. This is very, very beautifully expressed by Bhagavan in verse 22. What he says, it's all one sentence. Matiku oli tandu, matikul olirum, matiine ulle madaki, patil padutital andri, patiye matial mati tidital engan mati. What that means is, except by turning the mind back within, completely immersing it in God, who shines within that mind, giving light to the mind, how to fathom God by the mind. That is, as Bhagavan said in that verse 25 of Uludunapadu, of Upadesha Undiyar, he said, where is it again? He said, knowing oneself, leaving aside adjuncts, is itself knowing God. Tanne upadi vitu ovdu tan isan tanne udumudam. No, knowing oneself without adjuncts is itself knowing God. Why? Tanai olivdal, because he shines as oneself. So, God, in what sense does God shine as ourself? God is the original awareness, the light of pure awareness that is ever shining in our heart as our own being, as I am. It's only that light of pure awareness that is ever shining in our heart as I am, by which the mind is illuminated. And it's only by that, by borrowing that light of the original light, the light of pure awareness, but the mind is enabled to know the world. As he says in verse 7 of Uludunapadu, though the world and the mind rise and subside simultaneously, it is only by the mind that the world shines. So how does the mind shine, and how does the mind illumine the world? The mind illumines the world because it is itself illumined by God, who is what is ever shining in our heart as our own being, as I am. So since God is always shining in the mind, lending light to the mind, how is the mind to know God? The only way to know God is to turn the mind back within. That is, we can illustrate this with an analogy. If you have a dark cave and you want to see what's inside it, if you've got a mirror, you can hold your mirror outside and reflect the light of the sun, the light from the sun. We can reflect it we can shine a beam of reflected light into the dark cave to see what's in the cave. So the reflected light of the mind is useful for knowing the objects of the world. But how can we know God himself? If you lose interest in knowing what is inside the cave, and if you want to know the source of the light, which you're now shining into the cave, what do you have to do? If you turn the mirror that is now pointing inside the cave, if you turn it back to face the sun, what happens? Do you know the sun by means of the reflected light? No, of course not. The reflected light is lost in the original light, the light of the bright light of the sun. Likewise, if we turn the mind back within, we thereby immerse it in God. That God is the light of pure awareness that is ever shining in our heart. When we turn our attention back within to see who am I, we are thereby turning that mirror that was previously reflecting the light of the sun into the cave, to see the objects of the world. We are turning it back towards God to see God as he actually is. We thereby lose ourselves in God. We become food to God. We are swallowed by God, and he alone shines. So in this verse, Bhagavan is very, very clearly indicating that the only means by which we can know the reality is by turning the mind back within and thereby immersing it in God. In other words, we need to lose ourselves completely in God. As he said in verse 8, investigating and knowing the reality of ourself, and thereby subsiding and merging in the reality of God, alone is seeing him, is alone seeing him in truth. So to know God as he actually is, we need to turn our mind inwards, investigate our own reality, and thereby lose ourselves in the reality that is God. So in all these different verses, Bhagavan is pointing, however Bhagavan approaches the subject, he's always pointing back to the same essential thing. We need to turn our mind back within and immerse it in God, who is ever shining in our heart as our own reality. So what is that is, as Bhagavan said in verse 24 of Upadeshundya, Irkum ekayal isa jivagal oruparlayaba. That is, by existing nature, we and God are one substance. That is, God is our own being. So what is it that prevents us from knowing him? It is only the upadhyunavu. The upadhyunavu means the awareness of adjuncts. So to whom is this awareness of adjunct? This awareness of adjuncts is what is otherwise called ego. That is, when ego is the false awareness, I am this body. So long as we rise as I am this body, we don't know ourselves as we actually are. And when we don't know ourselves as we actually are, we don't know God as he actually is. So we need to lose this. Ego is the obstacle. So all Bhagavan's teachings are focused on knowing ourselves and thereby getting rid of this ego, because Bhagavan, like a great a really good doctor will not be interested just in treating the symptoms of the disease. A good doctor will try to understand what is the root cause of the disease. If you can tackle the root cause, then you need not worry about the symptoms. If you get rid of the root cause, the symptoms will go of their own accord. So, but the second-rate doctors will just treat the symptoms. But Bhagavan is not a second-rate doctor. Bhagavan is the greatest of all doctors. So Bhagavan has diagnosed what is the root cause of all our problems. All our problems originate, all our problems boil down to one fundamental problem. That is ego. Ego is the false awareness, I am this body. So long as we rise and stand as ego, we don't know ourselves as we actually are, and all problems ensue. So after this verse, after verse 22, the next 4 verses, he goes on to talk about ego. So I've got another 10 minutes. I will quickly try and go through these verses, because these are very, very important verses. What he says in verse 23, I'll deal with this a little bit quickly. He says, Nan endru ideham nabiladu. That means this body does not say I. When he says the body does not say I, that is a metaphorical way of saying the body is not aware of itself as I. And in the Kalivemba version, before this, he added in another clause, Mati Iladal. Mati Iladal means because it is devoid of, here Mati means awareness. Because it is devoid of awareness, this body does not say I. So, as I say, does not say I is a metaphorical way of saying it's not aware of itself as I. Why is it not aware of itself as I? Because it's devoid of awareness. Here, what he means by body is not just the physical body, it means all the five sheaths. Because as he said in verse 5, Urul Pancha Kosa Uru, the body is a form of five sheaths, composed of five sheaths. Therefore, all five are included in the term body. Adalal Eindum, Udulendu Solil, Udulenum Solil Adungum. All the five are included in the term body. So what he means by body here is all the five sheaths. The five sheaths are the physical body, the Annamaya Kosha, the life, the Pranamaya Kosha. That is all the physiological functions that animate the body. The mind, that means all the grosser functions of the mind, the Manamaya Kosha, the intellect, the Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the will, the Anandamaya Kosha. These five make up the body. So all of these are jada, as Bhagavan said in verse 22 of Upadesh Undya. All the five sheaths are jada. Therefore, they are not. They're jada and the sat, he says. Therefore, they are not satana nanala. They are not I who is sat. We are sat chit. But these five sheaths are they are asat and they are jada. They are not chit. They are neither chit nor neither sat nor chit. So he begins by saying the body is not aware of itself as I. Then he goes on to say, Urakatum nan endrum arum nabil vadu ile. No one says, in sleep I did not exist. That in other words, we are all clearly aware that we exist, even in sleep, in the absence of the body is the implication. And then he says, Nan ondru erunda pin elam erum. That means after one thing I rises, everything rises. That's only when we rise as ego, everything else comes into existence. And then the final sentence in the original Uludu Napadu is in the nan engu erum endru nun matial en. That means investigate with a keen, a subtle and keen and sharp mind where this I rises. In the Kali Vemba version, he says what happens if we investigate but thus. That is in the Kali Vemba version, he says, in the nan endru erum endru nun matial enna naravum. That means when one contemplates by a subtle mind where this I rises, it slips away. In other words, if we investigate this ego, it will slip away. That's why he said in verse 8, if one investigating and knowing one's own reality, if one investigates and knows one's own reality, then one will subside and dissolve and become one with the reality of that real substance, and that is the true seeing. Then in verse 24, the next verse, he begins to describe exactly what this ego is. That is the first sentence of verse 24. He repeats the same idea that he said in the previous verse. Jada udul nadu. The insentient body does not say I. That means the body is not aware of itself as I. Satchit udiyadu. that means Sat-Chit, the existence awareness, the real awareness, does not rise. So the body isn't aware of itself as I, the body doesn't rise. But Udalalava nan ondru udikum ideal. In between, one thing rises as the extent of a body. That is, since it is I, it's not the body, because the fact it rises, it's called I. That means it's aware of itself as I, so it's not the body, because the body is not aware of itself as I. And since it rises, it is not Sat-Chit. So it is neither the body, which is Jada, nor is it Sat-Chit, which doesn't rise. But it rises as the extent of a body. So this I that rises the extent of a body, that means this false awareness, I am this body, it is neither Sat-Chit, because Sat-Chit never rises, nor is it this body, because the body is Jada, and therefore not aware of itself as I. So it's neither this nor that, but it rises in between. Rises in between means it partakes of the properties of both. It borrows its existence and its awareness from Sat-Chit. It borrows its form from a body. So it borrows the properties of both, but it is itself neither. This is Chit Jada Granti. This is the knot formed by the entanglement of Chit. That means Chit here means the Sat-Chit, and Jada. Jada means the body. When these two are conflated as I am this body, that is called Chit Jada Granti. Granti means knot. Of course, Chit is never bound to the body, but in the view of ego, we are aware of ourselves as I am this body. I am is Sat-Chit. The body is something different. These two are conflated and taken to be one. And so long as we rise as ego, we are bound by this knot of false identification. So this is also bandham. It is jivan. Jivan means the soul. It is nupame, the subtle body. Ahande, ego. Ichamsaram, this samsara, manam. It is mind. So this false I that rises between the body and Sat-Chit, this is what is called Chit Jada Granti, bondage, jiva, subtle body, ego, this samsara, and mind. And then I've just got a couple of minutes for the most important of all the verses. This next verse, verse 25, Bhagavan reveals the true nature of ego. And this is as I said, Bhagavan diagnosed the disease, the root cause of a disease, it is ego. And if we understand the nature of ego, we will understand how to get rid of it. That is, in this verse, Bhagavan ends in the last line, he describes ego as uruvatra payahande. Uruvatra means formless. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. Hey means an evil spirit or a phantom. It's an evil spirit or phantom because it's got no substance of its own. It borrows its form from a body. It borrows its substance from Sat-Chit. But it is neither the body nor is it Sat-Chit. So it neither has form, it has no form of its own, it's got no substance of its own. So it doesn't actually exist. But though it doesn't actually exist, so long as it seems to exist, it's the root cause of all problems. So what is the nature of this ego? As he says, urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. That means as soon as we rise as ego, we grasp the form of the body as I. Urupatri nikam, grasping form, it stands. That means so long as we remain as ego, we continue to grasp the body as ourself. Urupatri undu mika ongam, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Since ego is formless, all the forms it grasps are things other than itself. So that this means by attending to anything other than ourself, we are thereby nourishing and sustaining this ego. That is grasping form, it means it feeds itself, it nourishes itself, and thereby it grows abundantly. Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form, it grasps form. So the very nature of ego is to be constantly grasping form. But the most important thing of all, Tedinal otum pidicum, if sought, it takes flight. That is, if instead of trying to grasp other things, if the ego tries to grasp itself, if it tries to know its own reality, if it seeks its own reality, seeks to know its own reality, it will otum pidicum, it will take flight, it will run away. Why? Because we seem to be ego only so long as we're attending to things other than ourselves. If we turn back to see ourselves, to see what we actually are, there's no such thing as ego to be found. Has anyone ever seen this ego? We all know ego is causing us so much trouble, but has anyone actually seen it? When people used to ask Bhagavan, how did this ego come into existence? Why did this ego come into existence? He said, first you find that ego, bring it to me, then we can investigate how it came into existence. Because if we investigate this ego to find out who am I, ego will take flight, that it'll run away, it'll disappear, because it has no real existence of its own. It's just a formless phantom. Phantoms seem to exist when you don't look at them closely enough. If you look at them closely enough, there's no such thing to be seen at all. So if we look at ourselves closely enough, this ego will take flight. And what will then remain, that is Uladu, that is the underlying reality. So how to, as Bhagavan says, becoming food is seeing. How to become food? Only by turning our attention within and to see what we actually are. When we turn our attention within, this ego will take flight and he alone will remain shining as the one reality that alone always exists. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.